Maid arrived with a bruised face and a secret letter. The Mafia Boss Promised. No one hurts you again. Sophia's hand shook as she tried to hide the purple bruise spreading across her face like spilled wine. But Marco Valentino had already seen it, had already dropped his coffee cup, which exploded across marble floors, and a look in his eyes promised that whoever put those marks on her skin had just signed their own death warrant. The crumpled envelope in her trembling fingers contained words that would ignite a war. And when it slipped from her grasp and Marco caught it midair, reading the threat scrawled across the front in blocky letters that screamed final warning, his voice went deadly quiet in the way that made grown men check their exits. He told her nobody hurts you again, said it like an oath carved in stone, and Sophia's legs buckled because she'd worked for the most dangerous man in the city for 3 years without ever seeing this side of him. The one that looked at her battered face and decided someone's time on Earth had just run out. Hold up, stop right there. Before we go any further, I need to know something. Where are you watching from right now? What city? What country? Drop it in the comments. And what time is it where you are? Are you watching this at 2 a.m. when you should be sleeping? Listen, if you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, you need to do it right now, because what happens next in this story is going to absolutely wreck you emotionally. The moment in part 3 when Marco finds out the real reason she's been hiding. You are not ready. Now buckle up, because this is about to get intense. Marco crossed the distance and caught Sophia before she collapsed, his tattooed hands steadying her with impossible gentleness for someone who broke bones like promises. He called for his doctor, but Sophia was shaking her head frantically, whispering no hospitals. Nobody could know. Please just let her work. The envelope hit the floor. Marco scooped it up, his eyes scanning the threat written in angry capitals, and his jaw clenched hard enough that Sophia heard teeth grinding. He told her she wasn't working today, told her she was sitting down and explaining everything, told her whoever did this was already dead. Sophia's mind spun through awful calculations. 3 years invisible in this house. The perfect employee who cleaned and never asked about the men arriving at midnight or the rapid Italian conversations behind closed doors. She needed this job desperately, had a 6-year-old daughter to feed, and an ex-husband who'd vowed to take everything, including her child. Working for Marco Valentino paid triple any normal job. The trade-off was simple: stay quiet, see nothing, collect your paycheck, survive. But her ex Carlos had found out where she worked, had appeared at her apartment last night with 2 cousins, and had beaten her while explaining exactly how he'd use her employment against her. Marco guided her to his private office, the room even his most trusted men entered only by invitation. He settled her into the leather chair reserved for business partners and enemies, categories that often overlapped. His eyes cataloged her injuries with professional precision gained from years of inflicting and assessing damage. The swollen eye, split lip, defensive wounds on her forearms, the way she held her ribs suggesting worse underneath. He asked again who did this, and Sophia shattered because the combination of rage and gentleness in his voice broke something that had been holding together through pure stubbornness. She told him about Carlos, about the marriage that ended when she'd finally escaped after years of escalating violence, about the custody battle she was losing because Carlos had money and lawyers while she had bruises and fear. She told him about last night, how Carlos beat her and gave her 1 week to quit and disappear with their daughter to another city where he could control them both. Or Carlos would go to police with manufactured evidence claiming Sophia was involved in witness tampering and evidence disposal for Marco Valentino. Complete lies, pure fiction. But Carlos had created documentation that would make Sophia look complicit in crimes she'd never witnessed. The choice was simple: run and stay silent, or fight and watch your daughter grow up visiting you in prison. Marco's face went completely blank, the empty calm that predators achieve before they strike. He extracted the letter from the envelope and read Carlos's actual demands. $50,000 or Sophia testifies against Marco to federal authorities about his criminal operations. The audacity was almost impressive. Carlos had looked at Marco Valentino's housekeeper and seen an opportunity for extortion and revenge wrapped together. What Carlos hadn't considered was that threatening Marco's people was the fastest way to stop breathing. Marco made 2 phone calls, both brief, both in Italian, too fast for Sofia to follow. He told her she was taking the week off with full pay, that she'd pack bag for herself and her daughter, that his men would pick them up within the hour for relocation to a safe house. Sofia tried protesting, said she couldn't accept this help, that she'd already caused enough trouble. Marco cut her off mid-sentence. He told her Carlos had made a critical miscalculation, had assumed Marco saw her as just another employee, expendable and forgettable. But people under Marco's protection stayed protected, and Carlos had just declared war on the wrong family. The word family hit Sofia like a physical blow. She wasn't family. She was the maid, invisible and insignificant. But Marco was looking at her like she mattered, like her pain made him personally furious, like avenging her had become his mission. He asked where Carlos lived, and Sofia's stomach dropped because she recognized that tone, had heard it in movies and stories about men like Marco. She begged him not to do anything that would bring police attention, said she'd just disappear like Carlos wanted, take her daughter and vanish. Marco's laugh was sharp and humorless. He told her disappearing was exactly what Carlos expected, that bullies like him counted on fear, keeping their victims running forever. But Sofia wasn't running anymore, because she had Marco Valentino standing between her and harm now, and Carlos was about to learn what happened when you touch something that belonged to Marco's world. Sofia wanted to argue that she didn't belong to anyone, that she wasn't Marco's responsibility, but her daughter's face flashed through her mind, sweet Maria, who was starting first grade next month, and asked every night when they'd stop moving apartments, when they'd feel safe. Carlos had beaten that safety out of Sofia's life years ago. Maybe, just maybe, Marco could beat it back in. She gave him Carlos's address, her voice barely a whisper, feeling like she was signing a death warrant even as relief flooded through her. Marco's phone buzzed. He answered in Italian, listened, responded with sharp commands. He told Sofia his men were outside her apartment now, that they'd escort her to pack essentials, that Maria would be picked up from her grandmother's house, where Sofia had left her that morning. Sofia's eyes went wide, because she'd never mentioned where Maria was, never told anyone at work about her daughter's routine. Marco registered her shock and explained that knowing details about his employees' lives was basic security, that he'd known about Carlos and the custody battle from the day Sofia interviewed for this job 3 years ago. He'd run background checks on everyone in his house because threats came from everywhere. What he hadn't known was that Carlos was actively targeting her. That oversight ended today. 2 hours later, Sofia sat in a safe house that looked like a normal suburban home, but had security cameras hidden in every corner and 2 of Marco's men stationed outside. Maria was asleep in the bedroom, exhausted from the confusion and excitement of the sudden move. Sofia sat at the kitchen table with an ice pack against her face, still processing how her life had transformed in a single morning. Marco had stayed at the house long enough to ensure they were settled, long enough to promise Sofia again that Carlos would never touch her or Maria again, long enough for Sofia to see past the dangerous crime boss to the man underneath who understood what it meant to protect the people who couldn't protect themselves. After Marco left, Sofia noticed the envelope on the counter, the one with Carlos's threats. Marco had left it behind deliberately, a message that he was handling this personally. Sofia should have felt guilty, should have worried about what Marco would do, but all she felt was a strange sense of safety she hadn't experienced in years. For the first time since leaving Carlos, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, the nightmare was actually ending. What she didn't know yet was that across town, Marco was making arrangements that would change everything, that would transform a simple act of protection into something that would bind their lives together in ways neither of them expected. Carlos had wanted to threaten Marco through Sofia. He was about to discover that threatening Sofia was the last mistake he'd ever make. If this opening grabbed you by the throat and won't let go, then you need to hit that subscribe button right now. Comment below if you think Marco should handle Carlos personally or let his men do it. Share this story with someone who loves mafia romance. What happens next, and what Marco does to Carlos, will leave you speechless. You think you know where this is going? You have no idea. Stay tuned. Carlos Martinez was having drinks at his usual bar when Marco Valentino walked through the door with 4 of his men, and every conversation in the room died like someone had cut the power. Carlos's hand froze halfway to his beer bottle because he recognized Marco immediately from photos he'd studied while planning his extortion scheme, and the expression on Marco's face made Carlos's bowels turn to water. Marco walked straight to Carlos's table, pulled out a chair, and sat down with the casual confidence of a man who owned everything, including the air Carlos was breathing. He told Carlos they needed to have a conversation about boundaries and consequences, said it quietly enough that only Carlos and his 2 cousins could hear, but the threat in those words made Carlos's cousin Luis actually stand up and back away, because survival instinct overrode loyalty. Marco's man Nico caught Luis by the shoulder and pushed him back into his seat with enough force to make the chair legs scrape loudly against the floor. Marco never broke eye contact with Carlos, just kept staring with those dark eyes that had witnessed things Carlos couldn't imagine and had done things Carlos didn't want to know about. He asked Carlos if he enjoyed hitting women, if it made him feel powerful to beat someone smaller and weaker, if terrorizing his ex-wife and threatening his own daughter's mother gave him some kind of twisted satisfaction. Carlos tried to bluster, tried to say he didn't know what Marco was talking about, but his voice came out shaky and thin like a child caught stealing. Marco pulled out his phone and swiped through photos he'd taken at the safe house, images of Sophia's bruised face from multiple angles, clinical documentation that made Carlos's handiwork impossible to deny. He showed Carlos each photo slowly, deliberately, making him look at what he'd done. Then Marco leaned forward and told Carlos something that made the blood drain from his face. He said Sophia belonged to him now, that she and her daughter were under his personal protection, and that Carlos had approximately 60 seconds to explain why Marco shouldn't drag him into the alley and teach him what real pain felt like. Carlos's mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. He stammered something about custody rights and being Maria's father, about how Sophia was his wife, and what happened between them was private family business. Marco's laugh was sharp and cruel. He told Carlos that Sophia wasn't his anything anymore, that beating a woman voided every right Carlos thought he had, and that bringing Marco's name into some pathetic extortion scheme was the stupidest thing Carlos had ever done, which was saying something given the competition. One of Carlos's cousins, the younger one named Diego, suddenly stood up and announced he wanted no part of this, that he'd told Carlos the plan was insane, and he was leaving immediately. Marco nodded at his man, who stepped aside to let Diego scramble toward the exit. That left Carlos and Luis sitting across from Marco, while the entire bar pretended to look anywhere else. Marco told Carlos he had 2 choices, and neither of them involved collecting $50,000 or ever seeing Sophia again. Choice 1. Carlos signed over full custody of Maria to Sophia immediately, dropped all legal claims, and disappeared from their lives permanently. He'd leave the city, start fresh somewhere else, and if he ever contacted Sophia or Maria again, he'd wake up in a hospital if he woke up at all. Choice 2. Marco let his men take Carlos somewhere private and explain in excruciating detail why threatening Marco's people was a terminal mistake, after which Carlos would still sign those custody papers but would need months of physical therapy to hold a pen. Luis made a strangled sound, and Carlos shot him a desperate look, but found no help there. Luis was staring at the table like he could will himself to disappear. Carlos tried one last play, told Marco that he had evidence ready to go to the police, that if anything happened to him, the documents about Sophia's involvement in Marco's business would be automatically released. Marco's smile was genuinely amused now. He told Carlos that he'd already had his tech people track down those supposed documents, that they'd access Carlos's email and cloud storage and laptop within an hour of Sophia showing up with her bruised face, and that everything Carlos had manufactured as leverage had been deleted from existence. More than that, Marco's people had planted their own evidence in Carlos's digital footprint, breadcrumbs suggesting Carlos was involved in drug trafficking and money laundering, insurance in case Carlos ever thought about going to authorities with any story about anyone. The color drained from Carlos's face completely. He tried to stand, but Marco's man put a heavy hand on his shoulder and pushed him back down hard enough to hurt. Marco continued in that same quiet, deadly tone. He explained that Carlos had fundamentally misunderstood how power worked in this city, had thought Sophia was vulnerable because she was alone and scared, had assumed Marco saw his employees as disposable resources. But Marco took care of his people because loyalty flowed both ways, and Sophia had been nothing but loyal and invisible and perfect for 3 years. She'd never asked questions, never created problems, never demanded anything. Then Carlos had shown up and broken that peace, had put his hands on her and made threats, and that required a response. Carlos finally found his voice enough to ask what Marco wanted from him. Marco laid it out simply. Tomorrow morning, Carlos would meet with Marco's lawyer and sign custody documents, giving Sophia full legal and physical custody of Maria. He'd sign a restraining order prohibiting him from coming within 500 feet of either of them. He'd withdraw all pending legal actions and motions. Then he'd pack his belongings and leave the city within 72 hours. Marco would know if Carlos tried to stay, would know if he tried to contact Sophia, or Maria would know if he breathed wrong. And if Carlos violated any part of this arrangement, Marco would stop being reasonable and start being creative about consequences. Carlos asked what stopped Marco from just killing him right now, and Marco's response was almost philosophical. He said that killing Carlos would make Sophia feel guilty, would make her think she caused a man's death even though that man was a piece of garbage who deserved it. Marco didn't want Sophia carrying that weight. So Carlos got to live, but only on Marco's terms, only as a ghost who used to exist in Sophia's world but didn't anymore. Luis had heard enough and asked if he could leave now since he'd just been backup and hadn't actually done anything. Marco told him to get out and take his cousin with him, and that he had until midnight to convince Carlos to accept these terms, because after midnight, the offer expired and Carlos's options became significantly more painful. The two men practically ran from the bar. Marco stayed in his seat, finishing Carlos's abandoned beer, while his men formed a protective semicircle around him. The bartender who'd been studiously ignoring everything brought Marco a fresh drink on the house, and Marco tipped him $100 for his discretion. One of the regulars asked quietly if everything was okay, and Marco said everything was perfect, that he just had a productive conversation about manners and boundaries and the importance of treating women with respect. The regular nodded and returned to his own drink, and the bar slowly resumed its normal rhythm of conversation and clinking glasses. Marco pulled out his phone and called the safe house. Sophia answered on the second ring, her voice tight with anxiety. He told her it was handled, that Carlos wouldn't be a problem anymore, that she could breathe again. Sophia asked what he'd done, and Marco said nothing she needed to worry about, just had a conversation that clarified everyone's expectations going forward. She didn't believe him, but she was smart enough not to push. She thanked him instead, her voice breaking slightly, and Marco felt something unexpected twist in his chest at the sound of her relief. He told her to get some sleep, that tomorrow they'd meet with his lawyer to make everything official, that she and Maria were safe now and would stay safe. Sophia asked why he was doing all this for her, what she'd done to deserve this kind of protection, and Marco surprised himself with his answer. He told her that 3 years ago when she'd interviewed for the housekeeper position, she'd been terrified and desperate, but she'd looked him in the eye anyway and asked only one question: would she be safe in his house? He promised her yes, and he kept his promises. Besides, he'd been watching her for 3 years, being invisible and competent and kind to everyone, including the lowest members of his organization. And people like that deserve protection from predators like Carlos. Sophia was quiet for a moment and then asked what happened next, what this meant for her job and her life. Marco told her that was a conversation for tomorrow, that tonight she should just rest and hold her daughter and feel safe for the first time in years. He ended the call before she could ask more questions because he was still figuring out the answers himself. Something had shifted when he'd seen Sophia's bruised face that morning, something beyond professional responsibility or general principle. He'd looked at her, trying to hide her pain and be invisible even while hurt, and he'd felt genuine fury at whoever had made her believe she deserved that kind of treatment. His second-in-command, Nico, asked if they were really letting Carlos just walk away, and Marco said for now yes, because Sophia's peace of mind mattered more than the satisfaction of breaking Carlos's bones. But he'd have people watching Carlos in whatever city he ran to, insurance in case the man was stupid enough to come back. Nico nodded and mentioned that the lawyer was already preparing custody documents and restraining orders, that everything would be ready for signatures by morning. Marco thanked him, and they headed back to the car. During the drive back to his estate, Marco found himself thinking about Sophia in ways he hadn't let himself think about before. She'd always been present, but invisible, part of the household machinery that kept his life running smoothly. But seeing her vulnerable and hurt had stripped away that professional distance and shown him a woman who'd survived years of abuse and still managed to be gentle with his elderly mother when she visited, who played with his sister's children when they came over, who left fresh flowers in the entryway every week just because she thought it made the house more welcoming. Sophia had been caring for his household and by extension caring for him for 3 years, and he'd barely acknowledge her beyond a paycheck. That was changing. He'd seen her now, really seen her, and something about that visibility made everything different. Marco recognized this feeling from his younger days before responsibility and violence had calcified his heart. It was attraction mixed with protectiveness, mixed with curiosity about who Sophia actually was beneath the mask of perfect employee. Dangerous territory given their professional relationship and the power imbalance. But Marco had never been good at denying himself what he wanted once he'd identified it. And he was beginning to suspect he wanted Sophia in ways that had nothing to do with clean floors and cooked meals. The question was whether she'd want him back once she realized the cost of his protection, once she understood that accepting his help meant entering his world in ways she might not be prepared for. Tomorrow would bring those conversations and those decisions. But tonight Marco let himself imagine what it might be like to have Sophia choose to stay not because she needed his protection, but because she wanted his presence. It was a fantasy, probably, the kind of hope that men like him shouldn't indulge. But as he pulled through the gates of his estate, Marco decided that maybe, just maybe, some fantasies were worth pursuing. Morning came with Sophia waking in the safe house to find Marco's lawyer already at the kitchen table with a briefcase full of documents that would legally erase Carlos from her life forever. The woman introduced herself as Patricia Alvarez and spread custody papers across the table with the efficiency of someone who did this regularly for Marco's people. Sophia held Maria on her lap while Patricia explained each form, each signature line, each legal mechanism that would give Sophia sole custody and establish a restraining order so comprehensive that Carlos couldn't even attend the same church service. Patricia mentioned that Carlos had signed his portions at 6 that morning looking like he hadn't slept, and that he'd already purchased a bus ticket to Phoenix departing that afternoon. The nightmare was ending before Sophia had even finished her coffee. Maria squirmed down from Sophia's lap and ran to the window where Marco's guard was visible in the yard doing a perimeter check. She asked her mother in that innocent 6-year-old voice why the big man with the gun was walking around their new house. Sophia's breath caught because she hadn't realized Maria could see the weapon, but Patricia smoothly explained that some houses had security guards like some buildings had doormen, just people making sure everyone stayed safe. Maria accepted this explanation and asked if they were rich now, because only rich people had guards. Sophia exchanged a glance with Patricia, who looked faintly amused. Patricia told Maria that no, they weren't rich, but they had a friend who was being very generous, and Maria declared that sounded almost as good as being rich herself. After Patricia left with signed documents and promises that everything would be filed immediately, Sophia tried to settle into some version of normal, but found it impossible. Every instinct screamed that this situation was temporary, that the other shoe would drop, that men like Marco Valentino didn't just fix women's lives without expecting something in return. She'd spent 3 years working in his house, and she'd seen how his world operated. Everything was transactional. Loyalty was purchased, favors were traded, and nobody got something for nothing. So what did Marco want from her that was worth destroying Carlos and providing legal protection and housing her in a safe house with armed guards? The question was answered when Marco arrived late that afternoon, knocking on the door instead of just walking, in which Sophia registered as significant. She let him in while Maria immediately attached herself to his leg, demanding to know if he was the generous friend the lawyer lady mentioned. Marco looked startled for half a second before his face softened into something approaching gentle. He told Maria that yes, he supposed he was, and Maria announced that made him her friend too, and did he want to see her drawings from school. Sophia tried to extract her daughter, but Marco said it was fine and actually sat down on the floor, while Maria spread out papers covered in crayon stick figures and enthusiastic scribbles. Sophia watched this feared crime boss admire her daughter's artwork with apparently genuine interest and felt her understanding of reality tilt sideways. This was the same man whose name made people nervous, whose business involved things Sophia deliberately didn't think about, whose reputation kept even other dangerous men at a respectful distance. But he was sitting cross-legged on the floor, asking Maria why the purple dinosaur was friends with the princess and nodding seriously at her explanation about magical kingdoms. Maria eventually got distracted by cartoons and wandered off, leaving Marco and Sophia alone in a silence that felt heavy with unspoken expectations. Marco told her that Carlos was officially gone, that the custody papers were filed and the restraining order was active, that Sophia's apartment had been cleared of Carlos's surveillance equipment because, yes, he'd been watching her for weeks. Sophia felt violation wash over her anew, but Marco continued before she could process it. He said her apartment wasn't safe anymore because Carlos knew the location, and even though he was gone, his cousins were still local and might harbor resentment. Marco had a better option. His mother's house had a separate guest wing that was essentially its own apartment, 3 bedrooms and full kitchen and complete privacy. His mother was elderly and could use someone checking on her daily, and Sophia could continue her housekeeping work there while having secure housing for herself and Maria. The pay would remain the same, and the arrangement could last as long as Sophia needed it to. Sophia's first instinct was to refuse because accepting more help felt like sinking deeper into debt she couldn't repay. But Maria's laughter drifted from the other room, and Sophia thought about her daughter finally having stability and safety in a home that didn't require moving every few months ahead of Carlos's harassment. She asked Marco what he really wanted from her, what price this protection and generosity carried, because she wasn't naive enough to believe it was simple kindness. Marco's expression shifted into something unreadable. He told her that what he wanted was complicated and probably inappropriate given their professional relationship, but since she was asking directly, he'd answer honestly. He said he'd spent 3 years barely noticing her beyond her competence at her job, but seeing her bruised face yesterday had made him realize he'd been deliberately not noticing her, because actually seeing Sophia as a person was dangerous to the careful distance he maintained with his employees. But that distance was gone now, and he couldn't pretend he hadn't noticed that she was intelligent and kind and beautiful even with a black eye. Couldn't pretend he didn't want to know her as more than just the woman who kept his house running. He wasn't demanding anything and would never use his position or her circumstances as leverage. But he was admitting that his interest in protecting her went beyond professional responsibility into territory he probably shouldn't acknowledge out loud. Sophia felt her heart hammering because this confession was both terrifying and thrilling in ways she couldn't articulate. She told Marco that she'd been afraid of him for 3 years, had kept herself invisible because women who caught the attention of powerful men rarely benefited from that attention. But yesterday, when he'd promised nobody would hurt her again, she'd believed him with a certainty that defied logic. And this morning, watching him sit on the floor with her daughter, she'd seen something that contradicted everything she thought she knew about who he was. She was attracted to him and terrified of that attraction, and had no idea how to navigate these feelings when the power imbalance made any relationship between them ethically complicated at best. Marco stood, and Sophia stood with him, and suddenly they were close enough that she could see gold flecks in his dark eyes. He told her he wouldn't push, wouldn't pressure, wouldn't use her vulnerability as an opening. But he wanted her to know the option existed if she ever decided she wanted to explore what this could be. Sophia's breath caught because his honesty was devastating in its simplicity. No manipulation, no demands, just a clear statement of interest and an equally clear promise to respect her boundaries. She heard herself saying that she needed time, needed to get stable and settled and figure out who she was without Carlos's shadow hanging over her. But maybe after that, maybe when she felt like she had her feet under her again, maybe they could see what this attraction actually meant. Marco smiled, and it transformed his face from dangerous to almost boyish. He told her that was more than fair, and he'd wait as long as she needed. Then Maria called from the other room, asking if Marco wanted to stay for dinner, and Sophia found herself actually hoping he'd say yes. He did, with the caveat that he couldn't cook to save his life, so whatever Sophia made would be better than what he'd eat at home. Sophia laughed and realized it was the first genuine laugh she had in months, maybe years. She made pasta while Marco kept Maria entertained, and the whole scene felt surreally domestic for a mafia boss and his traumatized housekeeper and her 6-year-old daughter. After dinner, Marco helped clean up over Sophia's protests, and they worked in comfortable silence while Maria played with her toys. He told Sophia his mother was expecting them tomorrow to see the guest wing, that Maria would have her own bedroom and Sophia could enroll her in the excellent elementary school near his mother's house. Sophia felt tears threatening because this was everything she'd been fighting for during years of court battles and Carlos's harassment. Security, stability, a chance for Maria to just be a normal kid. Marco noticed her emotion and gently touched her shoulder, asking if she was okay. Sophia nodded and impulsively hugged him, a quick, grateful embrace that she broke before it could become awkward. Marco left shortly after promising his guards would remain overnight and that he'd pick them up himself tomorrow morning. After he was gone, Sophia tucked Maria into bed and sat in the quiet living room processing everything. Her life had transformed in 36 hours from desperate and terrified to protected and hopeful. The cost was owing Marco Valentino in ways she couldn't fully calculate, but maybe that debt wasn't what she'd assumed. Maybe instead of owing him her compliance or her body or her silence, she just owed him honesty about what she wanted and the courage to eventually reach for it. The next morning, Marco arrived as promised and drove them to his mother's house, which turned out to be a beautiful older home in an established neighborhood with tree-lined streets and children playing in yards. His mother, Rosa, was a tiny Italian woman in her 70s who took one look at Sophia's fading bruises and pulled her into a fierce hug while muttering rapid Italian that Sophia suspected were curses aimed at Carlos. Rosa showed them the guest wing, which was indeed its own apartment, beautifully furnished and more spacious than anywhere Sophia had lived in years. Maria immediately claimed the bedroom with the window seat, and Rosa declared that settled that and pulled out cookies she'd baked specifically for Maria's arrival. Over coffee, Rosa told Sophia that Marco had explained the situation, that Sophia and Maria needed a safe place and Rosa needed someone reliable checking on her because her children worried too much. Rosa winked and added that maybe Sophia could also teach Marco to settle down and stop breaking his poor mother's heart by refusing to find a nice girl and give her grandchildren. Sophia choked on her coffee while Marco looked genuinely embarrassed. Rosa patted Sophia's hand and told her that she knew her son's reputation, but underneath all that dangerous nonsense, he was just a boy who'd been forced to grow up too hard and too fast, and he needed someone who could see past the armor to the good heart underneath. Sophia met Marco's eyes across the table and saw vulnerability there that made her chest ache. She told Rosa that she could see it, that she'd seen it yesterday when he'd sat on the floor with Maria, and again last night when he'd washed dishes without being asked. Rosa nodded like Sophia had passed some kind of test, and announced that she knew Sophia was the right choice the moment Marco had called yesterday, explaining the situation with such fury in his voice. Rosa's children never used that tone unless something mattered personally, and Sophia clearly mattered to Marco in ways he probably hadn't fully admitted yet even to himself. The next 2 weeks fell into a routine that felt almost normal. Sophia and Maria moved into Rosa's guest wing. Maria started at her new school and thrived immediately. Sophia helped Rosa with light housekeeping and cooking while Rosa taught her Italian phrases and shared stories about Marco's childhood that made him seem human and vulnerable rather than dangerous and untouchable. Marco visited daily, ostensibly to check on his mother, but always staying longer when Sophia was there. They fell into easy conversations while washing dishes or folding laundry, domestic moments that built something neither of them wanted to name yet, but both felt growing between them. Maria's first parent-teacher conference shattered the fragile peace when Sophia arrived to find Carlos sitting in the hallway outside the classroom with a smug expression that made her blood freeze. He told her the restraining order didn't apply to school functions where he had parental rights. His lawyer had confirmed it, and he was here to remind Sophia that she couldn't actually keep him from his daughter. Sophia's hands trembled as she pulled out her phone to call Marco, but Carlos grabbed her wrist hard enough to bruise and told her that her guard dog couldn't save her from every situation, that he'd found the loopholes in Marco's protection. And now they were going to renegotiate their arrangement, starting with Carlos getting weekends with Maria, or else he'd make such a scene at this school that Maria would be the talk of every parent and child. Sophia wrenched her arm free and told Carlos he was violating the restraining order right now by touching her, that she was calling the police. But Carlos laughed and said he'd claimed she initiated contact, and who would they believe, a respected father concerned about his daughter or a woman living in a crime boss's mother's house? The comment landed like a slap because Carlos had clearly been watching and investigating and finding ammunition. Sophia's finger hovered over Marco's contact when the principal emerged from the classroom looking concerned and asked if everything was all right. Carlos immediately switched to charming, introduced himself as Maria's father who just wanted to be involved in his daughter's education, and Sophia watched in horror as the principal's expression softened with sympathy for this concerned dad. Then Marco appeared at the end of the hallway with Nico flanking him, and the principal's sympathy evaporated into nervousness because everyone in this city knew Marco Valentino's face, even if they pretended not to. Marco walked straight to Sophia and asked if she was okay, while completely ignoring Carlos's presence. Sophia showed him the fresh bruise forming on her wrist, and Marco's jaw clenched so hard she hurt his teeth. He turned to Carlos with an expression that promised violence and asked if Carlos had forgotten their conversation 3 weeks ago about boundaries and consequences. Carlos stammered that he had every legal right to be here for his daughter's conference, that Marco couldn't intimidate him away from his parental responsibilities. Marco pulled out his phone and showed Carlos something that made all color drain from his face. Security footage from the hallway showing Carlos grabbing Sophia's wrist. Clear violation of the restraining order caught on camera, because Marco had anticipated exactly this move and had the school wired with his own equipment days ago. Marco told Carlos he now had evidence for the police and a lawsuit, but more than that he had proof that Carlos couldn't be trusted to honor agreements, which meant the original deal was void. Carlos tried to back away, but Nico blocked his path. Marco told the principal this man had a restraining order against him and had just assaulted Sophia on school property, that police were already on their way because Nico had called them the moment Carlos put hands on Sophia. Carlos's bravado shattered completely. He begged Marco to call off the police, said he'd leave immediately and never come back, that he'd made a mistake coming here. Marco told him that ships sailed the moment he touched Sophia, that some lessons had to be taught the hard way. 2 police officers arrived within minutes, and Marco handed them his phone with the security footage queued up. They arrested Carlos while he protested and pleaded, dragging him past students and parents who whispered and filmed on their phones. The principal apologized profusely to Sophia for not recognizing the situation sooner and promised that Carlos's name would be added to the Do Not Admit list immediately. Sophia made it through the parent-teacher conference on autopilot, listening to Maria's teacher praise her daughter's adjustment and academic progress, while her mind spun with Carlos's appearance and Marco's response. After the conference ended, Marco drove Sophia back to Rosa's house in silence that felt weighted with unspoken tension. Once they were alone in Sophia's apartment with Maria occupied at a friend's house for a playdate, Sophia finally broke. She told Marco she was grateful but terrified that Carlos would face charges now and blame her, that his family would retaliate, that she'd never be truly safe because there would always be another loophole or another threat. Marco cupped her face gently and told her Carlos was done, finished, because the restraining order violation combined with the assault meant jail time and a permanent record that would destroy any remaining custody claims. But more than that, Marco had made calls after tonight's incident, had contacted people in Phoenix who owed him favors, and Carlos would find that his new city wasn't as welcoming as he'd hoped. Everywhere Carlos tried to establish himself, he'd find Marco's influence blocking his path, making employment impossible and housing difficult and life generally miserable, until Carlos understood that the only way forward was complete disappearance from Sophia and Maria's existence. Sophia asked what that kind of reach cost, what favors Marco had traded to destroy Carlos so thoroughly, and Marco admitted he'd cashed in significant chips, including a truce with a rival organization that he'd been cultivating for months. Worth it, he said, because Sophia's peace of mind mattered more than territorial advantages or business expansion. Sophia felt tears streaming down her face because nobody had ever valued her enough to sacrifice anything real. And here was Marco Valentino reshaping his criminal empire's politics to protect her from her abusive ex-husband. She kissed him before conscious thought could intervene, pressed her lips to his with desperate gratitude that transformed mid-kiss into something hungrier and more honest. Marco kissed her back with a gentleness that contradicted his reputation, his tattooed hands cradling her face like she was precious and breakable. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Sophia told him she was done waiting, done pretending she didn't want this, done letting fear of complications override what she felt. Marco asked if she was sure, if she understood what being with him meant in terms of danger and scrutiny and living in his world. Sophia laughed shakily and said she was already in his world, had been since the moment she'd shown up with her bruised face, and she'd rather be in it with him than dancing around feelings neither could deny. They spent that night talking until dawn, sharing histories and fears and hopes in the kind of raw honesty that builds foundations. Marco told her about his father's death when he was 17, how he'd been forced into leadership before he was ready, how every decision he made carried life or death weight. Sophia told him about her childhood in poverty, her terrible choice to marry Carlos because he'd seemed stable and safe, the years of escalating abuse she'd endured before finding the courage to leave. They mapped each other's scars, both visible and hidden, building understanding through vulnerability. When Rosa found them asleep on the couch, the next morning tangled together fully clothed, she just smiled and threw a blanket over them before starting coffee. Later over breakfast, Rosa told them she'd already moved some of Marco's things into the guest wing because she wasn't blind, and she'd known this was inevitable from the moment Marco had called 3 weeks ago with murder in his voice over Sophia's bruises. Maria returned from her playdate and accepted Marco's increased presence with the easy adaptability of children who simply want the adults around them to be happy. The next month brought changes that solidified into new reality. Carlos pled guilty to assault and restraining order violations, taking a plea deal that included 18 months in county jail and permanent forfeiture of all parental rights. His family stopped making veiled threats after one of his cousins had a conversation with Marco's people that clarified the consequences of continued harassment. Sophia enrolled in online business classes because Rosa had encouraged her to pursue the bookkeeping dreams she'd abandoned years ago, and Marco paid the tuition before Sophia could protest. Maria thrived in her new school and started calling Marco's house their second home because they spent increasing time there as Sophia and Marco's relationship deepened from tentative to solid. Rosa played matchmaker shamelessly, creating situations that threw them together and babysitting Maria whenever they needed adult time. Marco's organization adjusted to their boss being in a relationship, and Sophia learned to navigate the complex world of being with a man whose business existed in shadows, but whose heart was surprisingly light. 6 months after that morning, when Sophia had arrived with her bruised face, Marco proposed not with a public display, but with a quiet conversation in Rosa's garden while Maria played nearby. He told Sophia he wanted permanence, wanted to build something real with her and Maria. wanted to prove that men who lived in violence could still create homes filled with love. Sophia said yes while crying and laughing simultaneously, and Maria shrieked with joy when they told her, because she'd been asking when Marco would officially become her daddy. The wedding was small and private, just family and Marco's closest people, held in Rose's garden with Maria as flower girl wearing a dress she'd picked herself. Sophia wore simple white and felt more beautiful than she'd ever felt in her life, standing across from Marco, who looked at her like she'd hung the moon. They exchanged vows that promised protection and partnership, acknowledging the unconventional foundation of their relationship, while committing to building something extraordinary from it. When Marco kissed his bride, Sophia tasted salt from both their tears and heard Maria cheering and felt Rose's approval radiating from the front row. The reception stretched into evening with food and music and dancing. Sophia watched Marco spin Maria around the dance floor and felt overwhelming gratitude for the chain of events that had led here. The bruised face that had started everything felt like it belonged to a different person in a different life. That scared, invisible woman had transformed into someone confident and loved and safe, protected not because she was helpless, but because she was cherished. Later that night, in their room at Marco's estate, which was now officially their home, Sophia told her husband that she'd never imagined this kind of happiness existed for women like her who'd made bad choices young and paid for them long. Marco kissed her temple and said that surviving Carlos and protecting Maria weren't bad choices. They were the actions of someone incredibly strong, and he felt privileged that she'd chosen to build this new life with him. Sophia fell asleep, wrapped in her husband's arms, knowing that tomorrow would bring challenges because his world always did, but those challenges would be faced together rather than alone. Sometimes the worst moments of our lives lead directly to the best ones, and the people we least expect become our greatest protectors and deepest loves. Sophia had arrived at Marco's door desperate and broken, seeking only employment and invisibility. Instead, she'd found a man who saw her suffering and decided her peace mattered more than his convenience, who dismantled her abuser's power and rebuilt her safety brick by brick. Their love had grown from protection into partnership, proving that even in the darkest circumstances, beauty can bloom when someone is brave enough to care without agenda and strong enough to defend without hesitation. Smash that subscribe button if this story destroyed you emotionally. Comment below whether you believe Marco would actually marry her. Share with someone who needs this hope. The next story is insane. You won't believe where it goes.